Well, hello everyone, and welcome to week 5 of our course. We are beginning to wind down our time together as we only have 3 weeks left. So let's begin. This week's look into the history of political events is an event that occurred during the Great Depression. It was also one of the most tragic events against American veterans in history. B, first time in American history that tanks were ordered to advance on American citizens. And C, had a direct influence on the election of 1932. Yes, you guessed it. It was the bonus March evictions in Washington, D.C. on July 28, 1932. But let's take a quick glimpse into the background of the event. In the years following World War I, a concern over providing a bonus payment to World War I veterans created difficulties between Congress and the White House. Previous presidents Harding and Coolidge both vetoed early attempts to provide a bonus to World War I veterans. Congress overrode Coolidge's veto in 1926, passing the, quote, World War Adjustment Compensation Act, unquote, more popularly known as the Bonus Act. The Bonus Act promised World War I veterans a bonus based on length of service between the dates of April 5, 1917 and July 1, 1919. It was divided into the following manner. $1 per day stateside and $1.25 per day overseas. Now, the payout capped at $500 for stateside veterans and $625 for overseas veterans. Now, let's take a look at what those dollars mean from 1926 until now. $625 in 1926 would be roughly $8,600 in our current comparison. Now, this isn't a huge amount of money, but it is significant as these men could use these for not just cash payouts, but could use them to use for education, to start businesses, for home loans. But the caveat to this was that the payout would not happen until each veteran's birthday in 1945. The veterans were allowed to borrow against calculated bonus beginning in 1927. However, the Great Depression occurs, and then by 1932, banks did not have the funds to cover the bonus loans given out to the World War I veterans. In 1932, nearly 32,000 businesses failed. Unemployment had soared to almost 25%, leaving roughly one family out of every 4 without an income. 2 million people wandered the country seeking employment. Many of the homeless settled in communities of makeshift shacks called Hoovervilles, and these were named after the president that they blamed for their poverty. Now, the bonus army, which was basically World War I veterans, brought their families to a tract of land known as Anacostia Flats, located near the Anacostia River within sight of the Capitol Dome in Washington, D.C. Meanwhile, during this time, Congress was deliberating on the fate of the veterans' payments. By June 13th in 32, Congressman Wright Patman, Democrat from Texas, himself a veteran, sponsored a bill that would immediately provide $2.4 billion bonus payments to World War I veterans. They wouldn't have to wait till 1945. This Patman's bill also had a cash now bonus finally that had made it out of committee and was headed toward a vote, which hadn't happened in a very long time. On June 14th, the legislation, which is the House, mandated the immediate exchange of bonuses. And these would be certificates for cash, and it came to the floor for a vote. Republicans loyal to President Hoover who were determined to balance the budget instead of adding to the budget, opposed the measure. Representative Edward E. Eslick, a Democrat from Tennessee, was speaking on behalf of the bill when he slumped over and fell and died on the House floor. Thousands of Bonus Army veterans that were in Washington led his funeral procession through the streets of Washington, D.C. The House and Senate adjourned out of respect, and the following day, June 15th, the House of Representatives passed the bonus bill by a vote of 211 to 176. Pretty tight vote. The Senate, however, was scheduled to vote on the 17th. Over the course of the day, more than 8,000 veterans gathered in front of the Capitol building to hear the results. Another 10,000 were left in Anacostia because the Capitol Police, had blocked off the bridge, and the police had did that because they heard that there was going to be trouble with the rest of the veterans if they were to make it to the Capitol. So the debate continued into the evening, and finally around 9:30 p.m., the bill had been defeated in the Senate. So the bill itself could not pass the Senate to get to the desk of the president. On July 28th, Attorney General William Mitchell ordered that the D.C. police remove the protesters from the government property. Since the defeated vote, 50 protesters had occupied buildings along Pennsylvania Avenue. When police arrived to move them out, a riot erupted, and police shot and killed 2 protesters. After that, the United States Army was called in to restore order. General Douglas MacArthur led the troops, along with his aide, Major Dwight D. Eisenhower, and the tank commander, Major George S. Patton. For 2 months, MacArthur anticipated violence, had been secretly training his troops in riot control. By the time the deadly conflict commenced, he had troops from Fort Myer, Virginia, to cross the Potomac and assemble on what is called the Ellipse, and that's the grassy lawn across from the White House. Major Eisenhower urged MacArthur to stay off the streets and delegate the mission to lower-ranking officers. But MacArthur denied his request, and he told Eisenhower to accompany him and assume personal command of the long-planned military operation. Under President Hoover's orders to drive the protesters back across the river, the Army was in position in the late afternoon. Once the order was given, the troops advanced with tanks, fixed bayonets, tear gas, to drive away the crowd of veterans and put them back across the bridge into their settlement in Anacostia. For the first time in the nation's history, tanks rolled through the streets of the Capitol. MacArthur ordered his men to clear the downtown of veterans, their numbers estimated at about 8,000 men, and some were spectators who had been drawn to the scene by radio reports. At 4:30 p.m., nearly 200 mounted cavalry, sabers drawn and pennants flying, wheeled out of the Ellipse. At the head of this contingent rode their executive officer, George S. Patton, followed by 5 tanks and about 300 helmeted infantrymen, brandishing loaded rifles with fixed bayonets. The cavalry drove most pedestrians, curious onlookers, the soldiers, civil servants, and members of the bonus army, many with wives and their children, off the streets. Infantrymen wearing gas masks hurled hundreds of tear gas grenades at the dispersing crowd. The detonated grenades caused dozens of fires. The flimsy shelters veterans had been living in went up in flames. Hoover twice sent messages to MacArthur to not cross the bridge, but simply move the protesters out of the city. MacArthur ignored these orders from the president and continued to press the men into their camp at the Anacostia Flats on the far side of the river. The camp was still inhabited by about 10,000 people, men, women, and children, who were driven off by the cavalry with tanks and tear gas. Then the infantry followed, setting fire to the shanties. DC's hospitals were overwhelmed with the wounded. Operationally, the exercise was seen as a success by the United States Army. Over the next few days, the newspapers and theaters' newsreels showed scenes of fleeing veterans and their families, shacks on fire, clouds of tear gas, soldiers wielding fixed bayonets, and cavalrymen waving sabers. One narrator stated, quote, "It's the war. The greatest concentration of fighting troops in Washington since 1865. Veterans are being forced out of their shacks by the troops who have been called out by the President of the United States," end of quote. In movie theaters across America, the Army was booed. The ramifications of the Bonus Army eviction violence was significant in the United States. First, the Bonus Army did not discriminate between black and white soldiers within their camps. In this southern city, Washington, D.C., where schools, buses, and movies remained segregated, the Bonus Army had white and black soldiers and their families. They lived together, they worked together, they ate together, and they played together. Jim Banks, the grandson of a slave, looked back on the camp as, quote, "the first massive integrated effort that I could remember," end of quote. Roy Wilkins, the civil rights activist who in 1932 wrote columns for the newspaper The Crisis, the NAACP monthly paper, noted that, quote, "there was one person absent in the Bonus Army," and he said that it was Jim Crow, end of quote. Number two, significantly assisted FDR in winning the election of 1932. Although the Democrat presidential nominee Franklin Delano Roosevelt opposed immediate payment of the bonus on grounds that it would favor a special class of citizen at a time when all were suffering, following the reading of the newspaper reports of MacArthur's eviction, he told an advisor, "This will elect me." 3 months later, Roosevelt did win the election of 1932 by 7 million votes. George Patton, on viewing what had happened, he later acknowledged that this and said that the Army is, quote, "setting against a crowd rather than against a mob," end of quote, had ensured the election of a Democrat. Hoover biographer David Berner agreed the incident dealt a final blow to Hoover's re-election hopes. Quote, "in the minds of most analysts, whatever doubt had remained about the outcome of the presidential election was now gone. Hoover was going to lose. The Bonus Army was his final failure, his symbolic end," end of quote. The political consequences were severe, as 1932 was an election year and the economy was the prevailing issue, and the Bonus Army incident showing starving and tattered veterans being driven off by tanks weakened Hoover's bid for re-election. The country was aching for change. And lastly, FDR creates the Servicemen's Readjustment Act in 1944. Now, this is basically, or not basically, it is the GI Bill. And so President Roosevelt, overcoming his long-standing opposition to the privileges for veterans, signed the bill, and this, of course, now we know it as the GI Bill of 1944. This money could be used for anything the veteran needed, such as education, starting businesses, or home purchases. My own father was a Seabee in World War II, and so he had training as an electrician. So when he went after World War II, he went right to work. So what he did with his GI Bill was to put a down payment on the house that I grew up in. There would not be a Republican president until Dwight D. Eisenhower wins the election of 1952. There's some significant historical and political ramifications that happen during this bonus eviction event. I encourage you to research this more. There's a little bit, I'm giving you just a synopsis, but the whole thing was a tragic moment in American history. Okay, let's go to the overview of week 5. For this week, the chapters from the textbook are chapters 12 and 14 that need to be read. Remember, you have to read the chapters to take the quiz. Do not forget to participate in the class discussion for week 5, which is political parties 2. Remember to get the points for the assignment. You must post your discussion as well as comment on another student's post. There's only one video lecture assigned for this week, so you only have one thing to watch. It's about just a hair over an hour long, and so once you watch that, you may write your discussion of your opinions and information in the lecture. Well, now you should now be aware of the information and the expectations of week 5. Remember, folks, we're winding down the class. We've only have 3 more weeks left, and one of those weeks is strictly the final exam. So really, weeks 6 and 7 are the only weeks left that you have any work due. Okay? So, with all that being said and the things going on in our class, it is time for a donut. Have a great week, everybody.